The human brain can maintain consciousness for nearly half a minute following decapitation, a terrifying final period during which eyes may flutter, mouths might move, and cognition persists as existence ebbs away. For Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second spouse, and arguably history's most notorious executed monarch, this nightmarish prospect represented merely one element of her death that modern narratives frequently gloss over. The authentic account of Anne's last moments exposes a mental anguish far more chilling than a mere blade's descent, a deliberate political theatre crafted to obliterate not only her flesh, but her entire historical presence. Anne's death serves as evidence of Tudor England's merciless legal framework, where execution was simply the crescendo of a meticulously planned degradation. Most historical texts merely record her beheading for sedition. The truth of her concluding weeks encompasses a psychological dismantlement so systematic it could rival contemporary interrogation methods. Her death wasn't merely a conclusion. It marked the closing scene in Henry VIII's crusade to eliminate a woman who had become too influential for his tolerance. By May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn had already survived 17 days of confinement in the Tower of London, the identical stronghold where she had once readied herself for her coronation ceremony. Merely 3 years prior, she had received England's crown in a magnificent ritual at Westminster Abbey. Now she faced execution in an eerie suspension, continuously postponed, while Henry VIII mercilessly prolonged her mental suffering. The monarch had specifically imported a skilled executioner from Calais to carry out the killing, abandoning the customary English blade, a choice often portrayed as merciful, but which merely highlighted the performative character of the approaching spectacle. Throughout her remaining hours, Anne displayed an almost supernatural composure, characterized by observers as jovial, even while facing imminent death. Contemporary psychologists might identify this as detachment, a mental protection response activated by severe distress. She allegedly made light of becoming Anne sans tête, Anne without a head, exhibiting dark wit that concealed her internal chaos. Rare historical records recognize the absolute dread she must have experienced, knowing her standing was being methodically destroyed through fabricated charges of infidelity, forbidden relationships, and plotting regicide. What renders Anne's execution exceptionally horrifying isn't solely the physical beheading, but the systematic demolition of her persona. Henry VIII desired more than Anne's death. He sought her complete elimination from records, her accomplishments voided, and her child Elizabeth stripped of legitimacy. The execution represented the peak of a reputation destruction effort designed to convince the English populace why their formerly cherished queen merited such a fate. In the period preceding her death, Anne was compelled to endure graphic, invented stories of her supposed sexual misconduct. Allegations so absurd they would be rejected by any contemporary tribunal. The morning of May 19th arrived unusually luminous for London, a sharp contrast to the sinister events about to unfold. Anne had passed her final evening in devotion, though rest continually escaped her. Tower documentation shows she requested communion at dawn, prostrating before the sacrament for extended periods in frantic spiritual connection. By sunrise, she had remained alert for nearly 24 hours, her psyche undoubtedly shattered by tension and fatigue. When the tower commander arrived to collect her, she was reportedly chuckling with her attendants, a response indicating not tranquility, but mental collapse. Anne's execution had been arranged and rearranged repeatedly, and frequently ignored method of psychological torment. The ambiguity of not knowing precisely when death would arrive was an intentional strategy employed against captives. When finally notified that the moment had come, Anne was escorted from her quarters, through hallways where just 3 years earlier she had paraded as queen-elect. Now, sentries surrounded her not from reverence, but to prevent flight, and the same nobles who had once genuflected before her now observed her ultimate journey with measured disinterest. The platform constructed on Tower Green was remarkably modest, rising merely 3 feet above ground level. Unlike the imposing structures frequently shown in dramatizations, this intentional engineering forced Anne to ascend only slightly, stripping her of dignified elevation and maintaining her proximity to the mocking audience. While contemporary portrayals often depict a solemn, reverent assembly, historical documentation suggests a festival-like mood had been fostered. The execution was public entertainment, ultimately a demonstration to anyone who might oppose the monarch's power, especially women who presumed to exceed their position. Before positioning herself at the execution block, Anne was allowed a concluding address, not from compassion, but because custom required it. Her statements, precisely calculated, demonstrated both her political intelligence and her desperate situation. "Good Christian people, I have arrived here to die, for by the law and through the law I am condemned to perish, and therefore I shall say nothing against it." This seeming acceptance of her destiny was, actually, her ultimate act of resistance. By recognizing the legal system while avoiding guilt admission, she subtly questioned the validity of accusations against her. Most unsettling, possibly, was the sovereign's non-attendance. Unlike typical public representations of royal executions, Henry VIII remained absent, instead remaining at Whitehall Palace awaiting confirmation of Anne's demise. Even as the blade separated her head from her body, Henry was allegedly celebrating his forthcoming union with Jane Seymour, a harsh demonstration of how thoroughly discarded Anne had become. The intimate had transformed into political, and Anne's death was simply an awkward requirement in the king's quest for a male successor. The executioner from Calais, specifically commissioned and paid considerable compensation for his skill, embodied another dimension of calculated brutality. Conventional English beheadings employed an axe, which frequently demanded multiple strikes to completely sever the head. The French swordsman's technique required Anne to remain motionless through pure determination, preserving dignity even as the executioner readied his attack. This stance compelled Anne to maintain stillness through absolute willpower, sustaining composure even while the swordsman prepared his strike. Observers noted that she constantly moved her mouth, and her eyes shifted beneath the covering as she attempted to perceive any indication of the approaching weapon. The psychological agony of this instant, understanding death approaches, but not its timing, constitutes a torture form seldom recognized in sanitized historical narratives. The actual beheading was remarkably efficient by Tudor measures. One stroke severed Anne's head, but what occurred immediately afterward is frequently excluded from refined historical accounts. Based on witness testimonies, her eyes and mouth continued moving for multiple seconds following decapitation, a terrifying physiological reaction occurring when oxygen lingers in brain matter. Some records even indicate her lips shaped words, possibly continuing the prayer interrupted by the sword's descent. The vision was so horrifying that multiple witnesses collapsed, while others averted their gaze in terror at this stark reminder of the fragile link between flesh and spirit. Perhaps most revealing, no appropriate burial container had been arranged for Anne's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, overwhelmed by sorrow and shock, had to hastily locate an arrow box to contain her head and body. This apparently minor neglect speaks extensively about the complete disrespect for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was an afterthought, a political obstacle resolved, rather than a human deserving fundamental funeral respect. She was quickly interred in an anonymous grave within the Tower Chapel, without proper Christian ritual, as though the king hoped her memory would vanish as rapidly as her life had ended. Henry's resolve to erase Anne extended beyond her physical elimination. Court artists received instructions to destroy her portraits. Her royal symbols were carved from palace surfaces, and courtiers quickly discovered that mentioning her name could result in royal displeasure. While we often concentrate on the physical aspect of beheading, this systematic elimination of Anne's very being represents a violence form that transcended her death, an attempt to execute not merely a person, but an entire legacy. Centuries would pass before historians began the meticulous process of reconstructing Anne's existence from the remnants that survived Henry's purge. Anne's execution also traumatized those compelled to observe it, particularly her female attendants, who had to cleanse and prepare her severed head before interment. These women, themselves frightened of being connected to the Queen's supposed crimes, had to accomplish this horrific duty while maintaining composure. Multiple individuals reportedly experienced nightmares for years subsequently, and at least one eventually joined religious orders, unable to continue court existence after her experiences. The expanding effects of psychological trauma reached far beyond Anne herself, establishing a fear atmosphere that saturated Henry's court throughout his remaining reign. In the immediate wake of the execution, Anne's child Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was pronounced illegitimate and excluded from succession rights. The child who would eventually become England's greatest monarch was effectively abandoned, her mother executed, and her father publicly rejecting her. Court documentation reveals Elizabeth suddenly lacked appropriate clothing or care suitable to her previous rank. Her household disbanded almost immediately. This harsh treatment of a small child represents another aspect of the horror surrounding Anne's execution. The consequences extended even to her innocent offspring. Most contemporary depictions of Tudor executions fail to convey the overwhelming sensory reality. The scaffold would have stunk of blood from earlier executions, swarming with insects in the May heat. The crowd's noise, manipulated by planted supporters instructed to applaud the Queen's death, formed a sound barrier designed to confuse and frighten. Anne would have perceived this din growing stronger as she neared Tower Green, the mockery and insults from a population encouraged to regard her as a sorceress and unfaithful wife. This carefully coordinated public shame formed a crucial component of Tudor justice. Death alone was insufficient punishment. Popular media often romanticizes Anne's concluding speech as a moment of noble resistance, but historical documentation suggests a more complex reality. Her precisely worded statement, praising the monarch as a kind and sovereign ruler, reflects the impossible circumstances she faced. Even confronting inevitable death, Anne could not express herself freely. Her words were limited by worry for her daughter's prospects and the observing crowd's response. Her speech represents not expressive freedom, but its antithesis, the ultimate silencing of a woman who understood that even her final statements would be conveyed to the king and could affect those she abandoned. The weapon that terminated Anne's life, specially brought from France, symbolizes the theatrical element of her execution. Henry invested substantially to guarantee a spectacle befitting a queen's destruction. The executioner himself allegedly practiced on livestock beforehand, determined to accomplish the clean single blow that would earn his considerable payment. This detached professionalism, the transformation of Anne's death into a technical problem, exemplifies the dehumanization inherent in government-authorized execution. She wasn't simply killed, she was processed through a mechanism designed to convert human agony into political communication. Contemporary records note that no English executioner would undertake the assignment. The blade completed its work, but not before the executioner raised the severed head by its hair, a customary display meant to show the completed sentence to the audience. That shocking scene, with blood still dripping from the neck, is something witnesses won't easily forget. Tower documentation indicates that Anne's remains were interred so hastily that appropriate Christian burial ceremonies were reduced almost to nothing. The arrow container holding her head and body was positioned beneath the chapel floor among other executed nobles, a disgraceful conclusion for a crowned queen. No marker was installed to show her grave's location, and for centuries her precise burial site remained undiscovered. This elimination of even her final resting place represents the culmination of Henry's campaign to remove Anne, not just from existence, but from historical record itself, a campaign that nearly succeeded. In the period following the execution, Henry's propagandists labored diligently to construct the public story. Court writers who had previously celebrated Anne's intelligence and beauty now composed works condemning her as a manipulative adulteress. Official records emphasized the king's kindness in supplying a skilled swordsman rather than the traditional axe, reframing Henry's theatrical decision as compassionate consideration. The execution's horror was systematically cleansed in official documentation, initiating the centuries-long process of historical revision that continues influencing our comprehension of Anne's final moments. Perhaps most disturbing to modern perspectives is how rapidly life resumed normally for Henry VIII. The very day following Anne's execution, he became officially betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 14 days of sending his second wife to the scaffold, Henry wed his third in a private ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This heartless speed reveals the execution as merely a practical solution to a political dilemma. Anne had failed to produce a male heir, so she was eliminated, and the personal tragedy of her death was completely subordinated to governance and dynasty construction. The psychological aspect of Anne's execution extended beyond the immediate event. For weeks before her death, she had endured constant interrogation, been refused adequate sleep, and isolated from allies. Thomas Cromwell, the king's principal minister who constructed the accusations against her, utilized methods remarkably similar to modern psychological torture: confusion, sleep denial, isolation, and strategic deployment of false intelligence. By the time Anne reached the scaffold, she had already survived a campaign of mental destruction designed to ensure she would offer no troublesome final opposition. Court records reveal the exceptional security protocols implemented. Anne's execution required precautions far exceeding what was standard for even high-ranking rebels. The Tower garrison was expanded, and special sentries were stationed throughout the fortress complex. These measures weren't intended to prevent escape. Rather, they ensured that no ally could attempt a final intervention or mobilize public opinion against the execution. The overwhelming demonstration of force served another function too, intimidating anyone who might empathize with Anne into silent acceptance of the king's decision. The execution's timing, scheduled for mid-morning rather than the customary dawn, permitted maximum attendance by London residents. Tower Green could accommodate only a restricted audience of aristocracy and officials, but the Tower's prominent position meant that crowds assembled outside could hear the announcement of completion when church bells throughout London would then broadcast the moment of death, creating a citywide recognition of royal authority. This coordination transformed Anne's private suffering into public performance. Death as political theatre rather than personal catastrophe. Among the most neglected aspects of Anne's execution is the destiny of her co-defendants. 5 men, including her own sibling, George Boleyn, were executed just days before Anne on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths served to establish the reality of Anne's alleged crimes before her own execution, preventing any possibility that their final words might contradict the official account. This coordinated judicial slaughter of 6 people, all convicted on essentially identical manufactured evidence, represents one of Tudor England's most shameless acts of state brutality, a purge comparable to Stalin's show trials centuries later. While Tower Green today displays a memorial marking the approximate location of Anne's execution, contemporary records indicate the actual scaffold stood elsewhere in the Tower grounds. This geographical uncertainty is symbolic of how Anne's death has been repeatedly reinterpreted and repositioned, both physically and historically, to serve different stories. The sanitized romantic version of her execution, found in popular culture, bears little similarity to the psychological warfare, character destruction, and calculated cruelty that characterized her final days in May 1536. The terror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not just in the physical act of beheading, but in understanding it as the culmination of a comprehensive campaign to destroy a woman who had risen too high for Tudor society's tolerance. She was not merely executed, she was systematically dismantled, her reputation obliterated, her accomplishments nullified, her very existence nearly eliminated from history. When we examine the complete context of her final days, the psychological torture, the public degradation, the calculated theatricality, and the attempted erasure of her memory, we confront a horror far more disturbing than the swift stroke of a Calais sword. From a modern psychological perspective, Anne's execution represents a case study in state-sanctioned manipulation and public character destruction. The accusations against her ranged from adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, to conspiring to poison the king, charges so ridiculous they would never withstand scrutiny in any modern court. Yet, through careful manipulation of public sentiment, strategic use of torture, and the systematic construction of false evidence, Henry VIII succeeded in transforming a popular queen into a reviled criminal. The irony is that, despite Henry's best efforts to erase her, death, rather than her life, became her most lasting legacy. In understanding the complete horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, we confront uncomfortable realities about power and the construction of historical narrative. The sanitized version of her death, an unfortunate queen meeting a quick, dignified end, serves to obscure the systematic abuse of state power that her case represents. By examining the psychological dimension of her execution, the calculated torments, the public humiliation, the destruction of reputation, and the attempted erasure of memory, we gain insight not just into Tudor justice, but into how authority maintains itself through control of both bodies and narratives. In Anne's severed head, we find a warning about the fragility of truth itself when confronted with absolute power.